All right, I'm Nancy Butman, Chair of the Concord Historical Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. The focus of tonight's meeting is the preservation of Hangar 24 at Hanscom Field, as we've already heard. The CHC takes very seriously our obligation to protect and preserve all historic resources associated with the history of our town. To put the preservation of Hangar 24 in context, I'd like to consider briefly the history of Orchard House. When it was purchased in 1857 by Bronson Alcott, the house was in such disrepair that his friends encouraged him to tear it down and build something new. He chose instead to save it because he liked the fact that a Minuteman had lived there. He was conscious of his obligation as a steward of the house's history, even if his neighbors weren't. Over time, Orchard House again fell into disrepair, and by 1910 was considered to be in such poor condition that once again townspeople thought it should be torn down. No one in 1910, much less during the Alcott's residence, could have imagined that Orchard House would ever achieve the international fame it has today. Between 30 and 50,000 people annually tour the house. Countless others come to walk the grounds and peer in the windows. Orchard House has, in fact, become a National Historic Monument. Like Orchard House, the historic structure of Hangar 24, the site that housed the history that makes this building eligible for the National Register, is again in jeopardy. If we lose Hangar 24, we also lose its own history of reuse, having been moved here from Georgia. We lose the unique materials, the double-arched design, the reinforced concrete floor, its proximity to the runway, the scale and authenticity of the place, and with that, much of the meaning of the historic events that occurred here. Unlike the 19th and early 20th century residents of Concord who didn't appreciate Orchard House, we do know the value of the work done in Hangar 24. The developments, tests, and innovations that occurred here have contributed fundamentally to our technological revolution. And like the first shots fired at the North Bridge, this history reverberates around the world. Our knowledge of this makes our obligation to protect this resource even greater. An early and key invention to come out of Draper Labs working from Hangar 24 during World War II was the Mark 14 gun sight, which was designed to work while mounted on anti-aircraft guns on the deck of a rolling ship. This photograph shows similar guns on the USS Hornet, the aircraft carrier my father flew off during World War II. The Mark 14 allowed a gunner to accurately aim his gun at a target's future location, enabling an anti-aircraft shell to arrive at the right place at the right time. My father told very few stories about the war, but one he did tell was about the time gunners on the Hornet shot down a kamikaze pilot moments before it hit the ship. It was stunning to me to learn that the technology that saved my father's life and the lives of countless others was developed a few miles from where he lived on Elm Street in Concord. Hangar 24 has always been a research facility, and much of the work done there was secret. It is as a research facility that Hangar 24 secured its place in history, and as we learn more about what happened here, it's startling to realize how many groundbreaking technologies were developed in such a small place. Other well-known accomplishments from Draper Lab include gyroscope-guided automatic pilots, inertial navigation. This slide shows Charles Draper celebrating the first coast-to-coast flight using his inertial guidance system, development of the Daedalus human-powered aircraft, and instrumentation and guidance systems for the Apollo mission. Hangar 24 was also used by MIT's Lincoln Lab for testing a number of systems, including early radar development, civil air traffic control, and collision avoidance systems. Next time you hop a flight to New York, imagine, if you dare, what it would be like to fly without these critical systems, and then remember that it was the countless test flights flown out of Hangar 24 and the technologies developed here that have made safe air travel possible today. It was with this record of historic technological innovation in mind that the Concord Town Meeting voted in November 2007 to include Hangar 24 on our demolition delay bylaw, adding it to a list of only 50 properties in town. The FAA has determined that the proposed demolition of Hangar 24 would have an adverse effect on a property eligible for inclusion on the National Register. The Commission agrees completely. However, under Section 106, federal agencies have a further obligation to explore alternatives to avoid or reduce harm to historic properties. The italics are mine, but the quote is from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The Concord Historical Commission is unaware of any attempt by the FAA or Massport to really explore alternatives to the demolition of this historic structure. And yet, as you can see from this photograph, as recently as 1997, Hangar 24 was in use as a modern research facility. We can't help but wonder why demolition is the only course being pursued at this time. What makes it impossible to restore or adapt Hangar 24 so it can again be used for aviation research, or some other purpose? If alternatives were explored by the FAA and Massport, what were they? We request that the FAA provide us with information as to what options were considered, and ask also for documentation of the process used by the FAA to evaluate potential reuse alternatives before we can, in turn, provide useful comment on the Section 106 review. The value a community places on its historic resources changes over time, as we've seen from the Orchard House example. Undoubtedly, the historic value of Hangar 24 will increase as future generations look back and recognize, as we are only starting to, the pivotal technologies that were developed here. Whatever its next life will be, whether it is restored as a research facility, as a site-specific museum, or for aviation use, we must not hastily or capriciously destroy Hangar 24. It cannot be replaced, and without a compelling reason to demolish it, we have an obligation to the future to preserve it. And to our knowledge, there is no current, concrete, compelling reason to demolish Hangar 24. Whenever the Historical Commission is asked to comment on a Section 106 review, we require the applicant to submit documentation in support of their proposal. Blueprints if it's a building, balloon tests if it's a cell tower, and in all cases a photographic record of the area and an exploration of impacts on neighboring historic resources. Nothing equivalent to this documentation has been submitted to us by Massport. To justify the destruction of a building eligible for the National Register, the bar must be set high. Yet without a proposal to review for what will replace Hangar 24, it's impossible for the Historical Commission to comment on what the area of potential effect, or APE, might be. Until we know how Massport plans to use this space, we shouldn't try to second-guess what impact that use might have on the historic area around it. It's also unclear, without a concrete plan, what the critical need for development of this site is, or why Massport is rushing to demolish Hangar 24 without a viable proposal for development on the table, one which we can all review. The Historical Commission needs to see documentation that a serious effort has been made to avoid adverse effects, and we need to see a proposal specifically outlining what will replace Hangar 24 before we can responsibly comment on the possible adverse effects of this proposed demolition. Without an authentic area of potential effect, and we don't believe the FAA has yet determined an appropriate APE, we cannot evaluate how detrimental this demolition might be to neighboring historic resources. This is not just an historic building, it's an historic area as well, adjacent to the National Park, and it's hard to imagine how the demolition of Hangar 24 will not have a widespread adverse effect on Virginia Road, one of the oldest roads in the Commonwealth, which, in spite of commercial development and the presence of Hanscom Field, has retained to a large extent the winding stone wall-lined character of a rural road. The potential impact on Virginia Road of future development at the site of Hangar 24 is of great concern to us. In addition, 1/2 mile from Hangar 24 is the Thoreau Farm at 341 Virginia Road. Built in 1730, this National Register property is the birthplace of Henry David Thoreau and relies on its location on a largely untraveled, narrow road for much of its historic setting. One of the earliest houses in Concord, the Wheeler Miriam House, dating from 1692, sits on a hilltop, less than 1/2 mile from Hangar 24. These resources and others in the National Park will all need to be taken into consideration. But the greatest loss will be the loss of the hangar, its historic association with aviation, and the potential it has once again for reuse, just as Bronson Alcott once determined to save and reuse Orchard House.